Stalag 9C, Bad Sulza, Germany, December 1944. The guard tower searchlight swept across the frozen compound, catching a group of American prisoners huddled near the barracks wall. Hauptmann Werner Braun descended the stairs, his breath fogging in the bitter cold, prepared to bark orders at the captured Americans. Then one of the prisoners looked up. A black soldier. He spoke in perfect, unaccented German. "Guten Abend, Herr Hauptmann. Kalte Nacht, nicht wahr?" "Cold night, isn't it?" Braun stopped mid-step. His understanding of the world, of race, of hierarchy, of everything the Reich had taught him, cracked like ice underfoot. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 16, 1944. The German offensive tore through American lines like a knife through fabric. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last great gamble of the Wehrmacht. Panzer divisions punched through weakly defended positions, surrounding entire units, capturing thousands of American soldiers in the first 72 hours. Among those captured was Private First Class Johnny Stevens of the 106th Infantry Division, 24 years old, from Chicago's South Side, son of a Pullman porter and a schoolteacher. He had grown up speaking English at home but had learned German in high school and college, not unusual for a young black man in 1930s Chicago. German was considered the language of high culture, music, philosophy, science. His teachers had encouraged it. His mother had insisted on it. When war came, Stevens had been drafted in 1943, trained at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, shipped to England in October 1944. Arrived in Belgium in early December, just in time for the German breakthrough. His unit, green and unprepared, had been overwhelmed in hours. Stevens had spent 2 days hiding in a frozen foxhole before German soldiers found him, hands raised, rifle discarded, hoping surrender would mean survival. The Germans marched their prisoners west, away from the advancing Allied forces, columns of exhausted, freezing American soldiers stumbling through snow. Guards shouted orders in German, assuming none of the prisoners understood. Stevens understood every word, but he said nothing, kept his head down. Survival meant invisibility. They passed through German villages where civilians watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. Old women spat on the ground, children stared. Men of military age, too old or too injured to fight, looked at the prisoners with something like relief. Better these Americans be captured than killing German soldiers. The column reached a railhead. The prisoners were loaded into boxcars. 40 men per car, no heat, no sanitation. Straw on the floor. The doors slammed shut. The train lurched forward. Stevens stood pressed against other prisoners, feeling the cold seep through his uniform, wondering if he would die in this boxcar or at whatever destination awaited. Next to him stood another black soldier, Corporal Leon Washington from Pittsburgh. They hadn't known each other before capture, but proximity and suffering created instant bonds. Washington was shivering violently, his coat inadequate against the December cold. "You speak any German?" Washington asked through chattering teeth. "Some," Stevens said. "Enough, might come in handy, might get us killed." Stevens knew Washington was right. Speaking the enemy's language could be perceived as suspicious, could mark you as a spy, could get you shot. But it could also mean the difference between understanding orders and making fatal mistakes. The train traveled for 3 days. The boxcar became a hell of cold, hunger, and human waste. 2 men died. The guards opened the doors once daily to remove corpses and throw in black bread and water. Stevens watched the German soldiers, young men mostly, teenagers with rifles and tired eyes. They weren't monsters, just soldiers doing a job. That realization was somehow more disturbing than hatred would have been. On the 4th day, the train stopped. The doors opened, blinding winter light. Orders shouted in German, "Raus, raus, schnell, out, quickly!" The prisoners stumbled onto a platform. Stevens saw the sign, Bad Sulza, a town in Thuringia, central Germany, far from any front, deep in enemy territory. They marched to the camp, Stalag 9C, a POW camp for Allied prisoners, barbed wire, guard towers, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. The snow had been packed down by thousands of feet. The camp held British, French, Russian, and now American prisoners. Different compounds for different nationalities. The Americans were directed to their section, searched, registered, assigned barracks numbers. Stevens and Washington ended up in Barracks 14 with 30 other men. Most were white. A few were black. The racial dynamics of the segregated American military followed them even into captivity. White prisoners claimed the bunks near the stove. Black prisoners got the ones near the drafty walls. Some things apparently transcended national boundaries. The camp routine established itself quickly. Morning roll call at dawn, watery soup for breakfast, work details for those deemed fit, more soup for lunch, evening roll call, bread and margarine for dinner, lights out at 9. The days blurred together in cold and hunger and boredom. Stevens observed everything. The guards, their routines, their personalities. Some were cruel, some were indifferent. A few seemed almost apologetic about the circumstances. He listened to their conversations, absorbed information, learned the camp hierarchy. The camp commandant was Oberst Heinrich Müller, 52 years old, a career officer who had fought in the First War, lost an arm at Verdun, spent the interwar years in administrative positions. He ran Stalag 9 with bureaucratic efficiency. Not kind, but not unnecessarily brutal. He believed in order, in regulations, in doing his duty. The guard commander was Hauptmann Werner Braun, 38 years old. A former schoolteacher from Dresden who had been called up in 1943 despite his age, because Germany was running out of younger men. He spoke some English, poorly, and relied on interpreters when dealing with American prisoners. The interpreter was a conscripted local named Feldwebel Otto Klein, 60 years old, too old for combat. He had lived in New York from 1925 to 1933, working in a restaurant, before returning to Germany when Hitler came to power. His English was fluent, but accented. His demeanor was exhausted. He seemed to hate everyone equally. It was Klein who first heard Stevens speak German. 3 weeks into captivity, Stevens was on a work detail shoveling snow from the camp roads. A guard was giving instructions that Klein was translating into broken English. The instructions made no sense. The translation was wrong. Stevens, frustrated and cold, corrected Klein in German without thinking. Nein, das ist falsch. Sagt, wir sollen den Schnee dort hinlegen, nicht hier. No, that's wrong. He said we should put the snow over there, not here. The guard stared. Klein stared. Stevens realized his mistake too late. You speak German? Klein said in German, his eyes narrowing. Yes, Stevens said. I studied it. Before the war. Klein studied him for a long moment, then without warning smiled. A Black American who speaks proper German. The world is stranger than I thought. Word spread quickly. By evening, Hauptmann Braun summoned Stevens to the administration building. Stevens went, terrified. Interrogation, accusations of being a spy, a bullet in a snowy field. Instead, he found Braun sitting behind a desk, looking curious rather than hostile. You speak German, Braun said in German. Yes, Herr Hauptmann. Where did you learn? School, university, Chicago. Braun leaned back, processing this information. Chicago, he repeated. I thought... He paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal his prejudice too obviously. I thought most American Negroes did not attend university. Stevens felt anger rise but suppressed it. Many do not, he said carefully. But some do. And you studied German. Yes. German literature, philosophy, music. Braun looked at him like he was a puzzle that didn't fit together properly. The Nazi ideology he had absorbed for 12 years taught that black people were inferior, subhuman, incapable of higher thought or culture. Yet here sat a Black American soldier speaking German better than many of Braun's own guards, discussing literature and philosophy. The cognitive dissonance was visible on Braun's face. He dismissed Stevens without further questions, but the encounter changed something. Stevens was no longer just another prisoner. He was an anomaly, a challenge to the racial hierarchy that underpinned everything the Third Reich believed. Stevens wasn't the only Black American POW who spoke German. As word spread through the camp, others revealed themselves. Corporal Leon Washington, it turned out, had studied German at a black college in Pennsylvania. Private James Morrison from Harlem had learned it from his grandmother, a German Jewish immigrant who had fled Berlin in 1938. Staff Sergeant Robert Coleman from Detroit had worked at a German-American social club before the war. They formed an informal group. 5 black soldiers who could navigate the camp in ways other prisoners couldn't. They understood orders before they were translated. They overheard guard conversations. They learned which guards were sympathetic, which were dangerous, which were merely tired, and wanted the war to end. This created a strange dynamic. In the segregated American military, these men had been treated as second-class soldiers, given the worst assignments, excluded from many combat roles, housed separately, fed separately, discriminated against systematically. Now, in a German POW camp, their language skills gave them an advantage their white fellow prisoners didn't have. Some white prisoners resented this. Private Bill Henderson from Alabama made his feelings clear one evening in the barracks. "Ain't right," he said to no one in particular. "Them speaking the enemy's language makes you wonder whose side they're on." Stevens, lying on his bunk, debated whether to respond. Washington caught his eye, shook his head slightly. "Don't engage. Not worth it." But Sergeant Frank O'Brien from Boston, a white NCO who had earned respect through fairness, spoke up. "They're on our side, Henderson. And right now, understanding what the guards are saying might keep us alive. So shut your mouth." Henderson muttered something but fell silent. The racial tension simmered but didn't boil over. Survival took priority. The German guards' reactions varied. Some were uncomfortable, disturbed by black prisoners who spoke their language. It challenged their assumptions. Others were intrigued, curious. A few formed unexpected connections. One guard, Gefreiter Klaus Hoffmann, 20 years old from Hamburg, had studied English literature before being drafted. He started having conversations with Stevens during guard duty. Not interrogations, just conversations. About books, about music, about life before the war. "I read Langston Hughes," Hoffman said one evening in German, surprising Stevens. In translation, "The Negro speaks of rivers." It was beautiful. "You read Langston Hughes," Stevens said, not hiding his amazement. "In Germany. We are not all barbarians," Hoffman said quietly. "Some of us read. Some of us think. Some of us hate what has been done in our name." "Why do you fight then?" Stevens asked. "Because if I refuse, they shoot me. Because my family is in Hamburg being bombed by your planes. Because I have no choice." Hoffman paused. "None of us have choices anymore. We just survive." The conversation stayed with Stevens. Hoffman was the enemy, wore the uniform of a regime that had murdered millions. Yet he was also a 20-year-old kid who read poetry and wanted to survive. The clarity of hatred was easier than the complexity of humanity. Winter deepened. January 1945 brought colder temperatures and reduced rations. The German war effort was collapsing. Food became scarce even for guards. Prisoners received less. Hunger became the constant companion. But something unexpected happened. The German guards started treating the Black American prisoners differently than the white ones. Not better, necessarily, but with a strange kind of curiosity, sometimes even a grudging respect. Hauptmann Brown called Stevens to his office again in late January. This time he asked Stevens to help translate during an inspection by a higher-ranking officer. The Red Cross was visiting, documenting camp conditions. Braun needed someone who could speak both German and English fluently to ensure no misunderstandings. Stevens agreed. What choice did he have? During the inspection, he translated accurately, neither minimizing nor exaggerating conditions. The Red Cross representative, a Swiss man named Herr Richter, seemed satisfied. After he left, Braun offered Stevens an extra ration of bread. "Why?" Stevens asked in German. "Because you were honest," Braun said. "You could have lied, made us look worse. But you didn't. I told the truth. The conditions are bad, but not as bad as some camps. Why make it worse?" Braun nodded slowly. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Stevens asked, allowing himself a hint of challenge. Braun was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "What we were taught about your people. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Stevens understood. Nazi racial theory had taught that black people were subhuman, unintelligent, savage, incapable of civilization. Yet here he stood, speaking German fluently, demonstrating education and dignity, forcing Braun to confront the lie. This dynamic played out repeatedly. Guard after guard encountered the black German-speaking prisoners and had to reconcile what they were told with what they experienced. Some doubled down on prejudice, insisting the prisoners were exceptional cases that proved nothing. But others began to question. Gefreiter Hoffmann was the most vocal. He started bringing Stevens books from the Guard's small library, German novels, philosophy texts. They would discuss them during night shifts when Hoffmann was on guard duty and the camp was quiet. "Have you read Nietzsche?" Hoffmann asked one February evening. "Some. The Will to Power. Master morality versus slave morality. And what do you think, as a black man in America, about his ideas of hierarchy?" Stevens smiled grimly. "I think Nietzsche never experienced being considered inferior by birth. It's easy to theorize about natural hierarchy when you're born into the upper levels." Hoffmann absorbed this. "You know," he said quietly, "I think this war has taught me that hierarchy is invented. That superiority is a lie we tell ourselves to justify cruelty." Their conversations became a lifeline for both of them. Hoffmann, losing faith in the regime he served. Stevens, maintaining humanity in inhumane circumstances. Two men on opposite sides of a war, finding common ground in literature and philosophy. By March 1945, the Eastern Front had collapsed. The Red Army was driving west. Rumors spread through the camp. The Russians were coming. The war was ending. Liberation was near. But liberation by the Soviets terrified the German guards. They had committed atrocities in Russia. They knew what revenge might look like. As the sound of artillery grew closer, discipline in the camp began to break down. Oberst Müller called a meeting of all prisoners. "The camp will be evacuated," he announced through interpreters. "You will march west, away from the Russian advance. Those who cannot walk will be left behind." The announcement caused panic. Where were they being marched? To another camp? To execution? The guards claimed it was for the prisoners' safety, but no one believed that. Forced marches were often death marches. Prisoners who fell behind were shot. Stevens and the other German-speaking prisoners understood more than the official translation revealed. They overheard guards discussing the situation. The SS wanted to kill all prisoners before the Russians arrived. The Wehrmacht opposed this. There was conflict within the German command structure. Some guards planned to desert. Others remained loyal to the end. That night, Stevens gathered the other black German speakers. "We need to make a plan," he said. "If this march happens, we need to know what's really going on." Washington agreed. "We listen. We translate for the others. We stay together." Morrison added, "And if it looks like they're going to shoot us, we run. Better to die trying to escape than marching into a bullet." They spent the next days preparing, hoarding what little food they could, sharing information, watching the guards for signs of who might be dangerous and who might look the other way if prisoners tried to escape. The march began on March 28th. 2,000 prisoners formed into columns. The guards, nervous and exhausted, drove them west. The weather was cold but no longer freezing. Spring was beginning, though no one felt its promise. Stevens walked near Washington, Morrison, and Coleman. They listened to guard conversations. Most guards wanted to surrender to the Americans. They feared the Russians, they feared the SS. They feared what would happen if they were caught having killed prisoners. On the second day, an SS officer arrived with orders. All prisoners too weak to continue would be shot. Hauptmann Braun refused. He and the SS officer argued loudly. Stevens, close enough to hear, translated quietly for nearby prisoners. "The SS man says they have orders from Berlin. Braun says he answers to the Wehrmacht, not the SS. He says he won't murder prisoners." The standoff lasted an hour. Finally, the SS officer left, threatening to return with reinforcements. Braun immediately ordered the march to continue faster. He wanted distance from the SS. He wanted to reach American lines. He wanted to survive. That evening, during a rest stop, Braun approached Stevens. He spoke in German, quietly. "When we meet the Americans, tell them we did not harm you. Tell them we followed the Geneva Convention. Tell them—" He paused. "Tell them we are not all monsters." Stevens looked at him, this man who had guarded him for months, this man who had been raised in Nazi Germany, taught racial hatred, who had nevertheless shown moments of decency. What was Stevens supposed to say? That Braun was forgiven, that imprisonment under humane conditions somehow absolved participation in an evil regime. "I will tell them what happened," Stevens said finally. "Nothing more, nothing less." Braun nodded. "That is all I ask." On April 12th, American forces reached the marching column. Jeeps and tanks appeared on the road ahead. The guards threw down their weapons, raised their hands, surrendered without a fight. The prisoners erupted in cheers. Weak men found energy to shout, to embrace, to weep. Liberation. Finally. After months of captivity, they were free. American soldiers secured the German guards. A captain approached the prisoners, assessing their condition. Medical trucks were called. Food was distributed. The captain, a young officer from Pennsylvania, spoke to the senior POW, a major who had been captured at the Bulge. "How were you treated?" the captain asked. "It varied," the major said. "Could have been worse. Could have been better. Some guards were decent, some weren't." The captain looked at the ragged, exhausted men. "Any atrocities? Anyone need to testify against specific guards?" Stevens stepped forward. He had been translating this conversation in his head. "Sir," he said, "may I speak?" "Go ahead, soldier. Private First Class Johnny Stevens, sir. I speak German. I overheard a lot during captivity. Most of these guards treated us according to the Geneva Convention. Some were cruel, but not systematically. One of them, Hauptmann Braun, refused SS orders to execute prisoners. He probably saved lives." The captain looked at Stevens with surprise. "You speak German?" "Yes, sir. Studied it before the war." The captain turned to the German guards. "Which one is Braun?" Stevens pointed him out. Braun stood with the other guards, hands raised, face resigned to whatever fate awaited. The captain called an interpreter, then questioned Braun through translation. Stevens listened, occasionally correcting the interpreter when translation was imprecise. Gradually, a picture emerged. Braun had run a harsh but legal camp. He had followed military regulations. He had protected prisoners from SS violence. He was not a war criminal. "He'll be processed through normal POW channels," the captain decided. "No special charges." Braun looked at Stevens. "Danke," he said quietly. "Thank you." Stevens nodded but didn't smile. He hadn't done it for Braun. He had done it for truth, for complexity, for the understanding that war created impossible situations where good and evil blurred together. The liberated prisoners were processed through military channels, medical examinations, debriefings, paperwork, the machinery of demobilization. Stevens spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, recovering from malnutrition and frostbite. Then he was sent to a transit camp in France, waiting for transport home. In the transit camp, the segregation of the American military reasserted itself. Black soldiers were housed separately from white soldiers, served in separate mess halls, given separate recreation facilities. Stevens had survived German captivity, only to return to American discrimination. He met up with Washington, Morrison, and Coleman. They sat together one evening drinking bad coffee, processing everything that had happened. "You know what's crazy," Morrison said. "The German guards treated us better than our own officers sometimes." Stevens understood what he meant. Some German guards had shown curiosity, even respect, when they discovered the black prisoners spoke German. They had conversations, shared books, recognized shared humanity. Meanwhile, white American officers often treated black soldiers as inferior, as problems, as barely tolerable necessities. "But that doesn't make the Germans the good guys," Washington said firmly. "They were still Nazis, still part of a regime that murdered millions. A few decent guards don't erase that." Coleman agreed. "We got lucky. Ended up with guards who were tired and wanted to survive. Could have been much worse. Would have been much worse if the SS had controlled our camp. Stevens thought about this. The moral complexity was overwhelming. The Germans were undeniably the aggressors, the architects of genocide, the perpetrators of horrific evil. Yet individual Germans were just people, some cruel, some kind, most just trying to survive. Meanwhile, America fought for freedom while maintaining racial segregation, liberated concentration camps while maintaining Jim Crow. The contradictions were staggering. "What do we do now?" Morrison asked. "We go home. Back to America where we're still second-class citizens. Back to segregation. Back to discrimination. We fought for freedom, but we don't have it ourselves. We keep fighting," Stevens said quietly. "Different fight. Same principles. We prove we're human. We prove we deserve equality. We use every advantage we have, including our experiences, our education, our abilities." "And speaking German," Washington added with a slight smile. "And speaking German," Stevens agreed. They shipped out in May, a Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic. 17 days of gray water and uncertain futures. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through morning fog, the soldiers cheered. Home, America, for better or worse. Stevens disembarked in New York on May 28, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific would end 3 months later. He had survived, but survival was just the beginning. Stevens returned to Chicago. His parents threw a party. Neighbors welcomed him home. Everyone wanted to hear war stories. He told edited versions. The capture, the camp, the liberation. He left out the complexity, the conversations with German guards, the literature discussions. The way speaking German had forced Germans to confront their own propaganda. He went back to school on the GI Bill, finished his degree in German literature, became a teacher at a black high school on the South Side, taught German to students who looked like him, who faced the same discrimination, who needed to understand that education and culture were weapons against prejudice. He never forgot Klaus Hoffmann, the young guard who had shared books and conversations, never knew what happened to him, whether he survived the war, whether he made it home to Hamburg, whether the bombed ruins held anything worth returning to. He never forgot Hauptmann Braun, the conflicted officer whose worldview had cracked when confronted with educated black prisoners. Never knew if Braun learned from those cracks, if they widened into understanding, or if he rebuilt his prejudices after the war. But Stevens knew what he had learned, that humanity existed even in enemies, that propaganda dissolved when confronted with reality, that speaking the language of your captor could be an act of resistance, of assertion, of proving your full humanity. Washington became a college professor in Pennsylvania. Morrison opened a bookstore in Harlem that specialized in German literature. Coleman worked as a translator for the State Department. They stayed in touch. Annual letters, occasional visits, shared understanding of what they had experienced. Years later, in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement exploded across America, Stevens marched in Chicago, protested segregation, fought for voting rights. When people asked why he was so committed, he would sometimes tell them about speaking German to Nazi guards, about proving humanity in the least likely circumstances, about refusing to be defined by others' prejudices. The younger activists didn't always understand. To them, the war was history. The struggle was now. But Stevens knew they were connected. Every fight for dignity built on previous fights. Every assertion of humanity drew strength from past assertions. In 1983, a German historian named Dr. Petra Schultz was researching POW camps. She found records from Stalag 9C, guard logs, prisoner rosters, incident reports. In those dry documents, she found references to American prisoners who spoke German, Black American prisoners. She was intrigued. She tracked down survivors. Stevens was 73, retired, living in Chicago. She called, asked for an interview. He agreed. They met at his home. She brought copies of documents, guard logs that mentioned him by name, reports from Hauptmann Braun, noting the unusual situation of educated Negro prisoners speaking fluent German. Red Cross inspection reports that praised the camp's relatively humane conditions. Stevens read the documents, transported back 40 years. "I never thought anyone would care about this," he said. "It matters," Dr. Schultz insisted. "It shows the complexity of the war. It challenges both German and American narratives. It demonstrates that even in terrible circumstances, human connection is possible." She asked about his experiences. He told her everything: the capture, the camps, the conversations, the liberation, the contradictions. She recorded it all. "Did it change you?" she asked. "Speaking German to your captors, having those conversations." Stevens thought for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "It taught me that prejudice dies when confronted with reality. The guards believed black people were inferior, incapable of culture or intelligence. Then they met us. We spoke their language. We discussed their literature. We demonstrated everything they believed was impossible. Some of them changed their minds, not all, but some." He paused. "And it taught me that America's fight for freedom abroad was incomplete without freedom at home. I fought Nazis while living under Jim Crow. I spoke German to prove my humanity to guards while my own country denied it. That contradiction drove me to teach, to fight for civil rights, to never accept prejudice as inevitable." Dr. Schultz published her research in 1985, an academic book that few people read, but it documented a forgotten story. Black American soldiers using language skills to survive captivity and challenge Nazi racial ideology. A small story in the vast history of the war, but a meaningful one. Stevens died in 1994, age 74. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his military service, his teaching career, his civil rights activism. It didn't mention speaking German in a POW camp. That story remained buried in academic archives and fading memories. But the truth remained. In the frozen compounds of Stalag WWII, Black American prisoners spoke fluent German to their captors, and in doing so, dismantled propaganda through the simple act of demonstrating their full humanity. Every conversation was an act of resistance. Every translation was an assertion of dignity. Every moment of mutual recognition was a victory against the ideologies that had created the war. The guards who expected savages found educated men. The prisoners who expected only cruelty found occasional humanity. And in those moments of unexpected connection, both sides learned that the categories they had been taught were lies. That humanity was more complex, more surprising, more resilient than any ideology could contain. Klaus Hoffmann, the young guard from Hamburg, survived the war. He became a teacher. He never forgot the American prisoner who discussed Langston Hughes with him in German. Years later, he would tell his students that the war had taught him prejudice was learned and could be unlearned. That culture belonged to everyone. That humanity transcended all divisions. Werner Braun, the camp commander, returned to Dresden and found it destroyed. He taught school in the ruins. He never spoke publicly about his war service, but in private moments, he remembered the Black American prisoners who had spoken perfect German and forced him to question everything he had been taught. He didn't become a hero. He didn't atone for his participation in an evil regime, but he remembered. And memory sometimes is the beginning of understanding. The story of Black POWs speaking German to their guards is not a story of redemption or reconciliation. It's a story of complexity, of individual moments within vast systems, of humanity persisting in inhumane circumstances, of language as a tool of survival and resistance, of the slow, difficult work of dismantling prejudice one conversation at a time. The searchlight swept across the frozen compound. The guard descended the stairs. The prisoner looked up and spoke perfect German. And in that moment, something changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. And sometimes in the vast machinery of war and hate, those small changes matter most.